So it was summer of 1985. I was in between my sophomore and junior year in college, and I went to Ireland for 2 weeks with two friends of mine, buddies of mine from home, and we backpacked throughout a lot of the country, and we had almost no money. We stayed in youth hostels, and I remember we hitchhiked a lot, getting around. Not totally, but a lot of the trip was hitching rides. I remember being in a car once got a ride and listening to the radio, and it was kind of like a top 40 music station, and then all of a sudden on the radio the music stops and these bells started to toll, kind of like church bells, and that went on for a couple of seconds. You couldn't really miss it. So I asked the guy, I said, what's with the bells? And he said, that's the angelus, and they play it, those bells, I think every day at noon, at 6. This would have been around 6 at night. So I didn't know what that was. I said, what's the angelus? And he explained how it was a kind of a Catholic prayer, where the bells would be rung in the church, and you'd be out working. You'd be working in the fields, and you'd hear the bells, and they'd remind you to stop. And there was a little bit of a prayer that kind of talked about the incarnation and Mary's involvement in it. A couple of Hail Marys are said, and then you go back to work. In this case, they went right back to the music, and I was kind of amazed that it was a completely secular station, but it was this tradition that they had. Anyway, I just thought that was kind of cool. Sort of this sort of intersection of kind of like faith and just life. And then I thought about it, I don't know, maybe later that day or the next day or whatever, and I started to think about my grandmother, my Irish-born grandmother who lived with me growing up. And she used to say the Angelus. I remember now, or at that point I remembered, bells would go off at the church in town, and I remember she would start to say this little prayer, and we never quite knew. I wasn't really listening to her too much, but I knew she was saying some prayer, and I never really questioned it. But that's what she was doing, so it was really a part of a great tradition. There's actually a great painting of the Angelus, or an image of the Angelus that I found out a couple of years after that. I was actually in the seminary now at this point, and it's just it's a cool image. It's just sort of what I described. It's a man and a woman. They kind of look like they're almost like peasants, and they're out in the field at work, and their heads are bowed, and in the distance you can see the silhouette of a church, and they're clearly at prayer, and they're praying this Angelus. When you're about to be ordained a priest, usually at your first Mass, you'll have a little prayer card made, kind of commemorating the day, and you often use the image of a saint, or the Blessed Mother, or Jesus, some sort of a religious symbol on the front side of the card. And I remember just loving that painting of the Angelus, and really the concept of it more than anything. So I used that for my Mass card, commemorating my first Mass as a priest. And again, I just think it's what I love so much about it, or why I think it's so important, is it sort of challenges us to connect faith to our lives. It's easy to separate them, I think, and I think today, in a lot of ways, our culture almost pushes us to separate faith and our lives and our faith, and it's not a good thing. So how do you make those circles intersect? Kind of the life circle and the faith circle. Remember the movie Bronx Tale? It's a great movie. It's set in the 1960s. It's kind of the story of this kid and his relationship with these two men, his father and this local mob boss, and he's sort of torn between the two. Ultimately spends much of his youth being influenced in a negative way by this bad guy. But the father, Robert De Niro plays the father, who's a pretty honorable guy and doesn't like the influence of this mobster on his son, so there's a tension between them. And he's a bus driver, De Niro, this dad, and there's a scene where they're in the Bronx and he's driving his bus, and as he's passing the church, the local parish, you see that he does the sign of the cross, and as he's driving, he just, he's not looking for anybody to see it, but you see it, you notice it here in this scene, and it just says something like about his faith and his willingness to kind of maybe witness to it. We used to do that. As a kid, I used to do that. My family would do that. We'd drive past the church, and we're all in the car, and we just quickly kind of do the sign of the cross. Little gestures like that. I'm not saying it has to be the angelus. I'm not even saying it has to be the passing the church and blessing yourself, but what's something we can do, we need to do, we should do that brings, our faith into kind of our lives. Maybe it's something at work. Maybe it's something, an image that you, on your terminal, your computer terminal, of something that expresses your faith, an image of a prayer card, that has the Blessed Mother or a crucifix or Jesus. It doesn't have to be preachy and at all. It's just it's an acknowledgement or an expression of the faith that we need. Those circles need to intersect. If they don't, then faith is meaningless. Make it matter and intersect those circles.